Welcome. This video is part of a series of the Hidden Stories, Books Along the Silk Roads project and exhibition that came out of the Aga Khan Museum exhibition here in Toronto. And we're so pleased to be here. Today, we're going to be speaking about a Nepalese Pañcarakṣā Sūtra manuscript, the Sutra of the Five Protectresses, which is a manuscript that's housed presently in the Thomas Fisher Rare Book Library Collection in Toronto. And my name is Sarah Richardson. I'm from the University of Toronto. And
hi, I'm Jinah Kim. I'm at Harvard University.
And we've also got Alex here.
I'm Alexander O'Neill. I'm a researcher at SOAS University of London.
And we were brought together on a team looking at this amazing manuscript called the Pañcarakṣā Sūtra, the Sutra of the Five Protectresses, which is in this rare books library here at the University of Toronto. So I wanted to start by asking you, Jinah, what is this text? What is this Pañcarakṣā Sūtra?
So Pañcarakṣā Sūtra, this is a Buddhist manuscript from Nepal and of the Pañcarakṣā Sūtra. And Pañca-rak-sha means five protectresses or five protector goddesses, and they can protect their votaries from all sorts of calamities, from snake bites to escaping from misfortunes on the sea, from even defense from the torments of hell, pain relief from serious illness, defense of city against the enemies, so or any contagious disease. So it could be worthwhile bringing this out when there is a pandemic going on. So this is a multi-purpose protection text that is what is often referred to as a utilitarian Buddhist text. So that's what we're looking at.
Yeah. And utilitarian, why? Because it's used a lot?
It is used a lot. It's actually, it's not just for soteriological goals of attaining Buddhahood or, sort of the next stage of your spiritual path, but it really is pragmatic. It really addresses worldly concerns and what the fears of the daily life. So, and, it's akin to having a life insurance policy or insurance policy to prevent your house from flooding or, getting giant snake coming into your house. So every household, it's, especially now our Buddhist household in Nepal would have a copy of Pañcarakṣā Sūtra like this one.
Okay, cool. And Alex, what are we looking at here? Which pages are we looking at?
So you're looking at the first, the reverse side of the first folio, which has illustrations of the five goddesses, of the Pañca-rak-sha goddesses, and you can see on the goddesses actually that there are yellow and red marks, and these are usually called tika, but in Newari they're called sinha, and there's red or orange, as you can see here, and yellow, and these are part of a general worship for any object. So precisely what kind of ritual was being performed when these marks were placed is not necessarily clear, but essentially in any kind of worship of an object in Nepal, one generally uses 5 kinds of objects in worshiping an object, and this is called the 5 oblations or panchopachara. And so one of these offerings or oblations is offering tika. So there's a red one, which represents the sun god, Surya, and yellow, which represents Vasundhara.
We can come back to that page, I think, but we can talk about the goddesses first. And sure. I think the next slide will actually have more detail. So so as Alex was talking about, there are 5 goddesses, and this first folio often when you have a book cover that's covering the manuscript, will have the 5 goddesses kind of lined up together like this. And it seems this is sort of added on the first folio on the back side or front side of the folio. And if you go to the next slide, you can see the sort of idea of the goddesses. So in the center is Mahapratisara, who actually is I think of the 5 goddesses, Mahapratisara is the most well known. She is popular, at least known from at least 7th, 8th century Chinese text, and Mahapratisara also is, invoked in sea travels. So you actually hear about her when these Buddhist masters from India sail to China, and when they meet, troubles in the sea, they invoke Mahapratisara. So Mahapratisara is one of the most ancient one that is among the 5, and Mahamayuri is the one that actually is particularly important for snake bites. Mayuri refers to peacock, and peacocks are often understood to be, natural enemies of snakes. And there goes Mahasasra Pramardani and Mahamantrasanusarini Mahashtavati. And Mahasasra Pramardani actually sits on kind of what looks like a human, but often understood to be pestilence. So there are, diseases or any illness is often kind of quelled by Mahasasra Pramardani, who's blue in color. And these 5 goddesses also channel 5 Buddha colors, Buddha families. So you have the white in the center, blue, yellow, red, and green kind of lined up to tell you the 5 directional Buddhas of the 5 Tathagata families. And what you're looking at on the bottom is actually sort of about 1200, so like turn of the 13th century manuscript book cover. It's a wooden cover that have the 5 goddesses lined up slightly differently than what we see on the top, but you can see the earlier Nepalese example actually do depict them very much like the goddess with multiple arms, whereas this Fisher Library manuscript with this later painting, you can't tell unless I told you these supposed to be goddesses, that they're not like really distinct features about them that indicate they're female, but they are supposed to be 5 goddesses, and they all sit on these different animals or figures that are supposed to be vahanas or vehicles.
Yeah. Can I ask you, Jinah, too, why does this, so our painting is a much later painting than that amazing 13th century book cover below, but why is their gender so obfuscated? Like, yeah, they're much less feminized, right? They don't have as prominent breasts as the 13th century paintings down there. So when does that happen and why?
So this, I think it has something to do with a lot more Tibetan kind of interactions with Newari communities in Nepal, that especially in I think what I assume it to be kind of later editions, or probably 19th century edition of the painting on the older manuscript. By this time, there is like the Newari merchants have really an active role that they play with the trade with the Lhasa and central Tibet. And of course, Newari's Nepalese community has been a big sort of part of artistic production in Tibet, in central Tibet. And by this time, there is channeling of what's happening in Tibetan plateau, where you also have inflection of Chinese interactions. So there is multiple levels of inflection point that actually changes how the goddesses will look. And I do talk about how when you're in the plains in the South Asia, there will be really voluptuous body. And then you go to Nepal, the breast size shrinks. And then go further up north and east, it's going to be even less so. Like
almost erased. Almost erased.
Almost erased. But there are definitely goddesses. There are invoked as goddesses, because the Sanskrit as a language is gendered, and the goddesses are clearly marked as,
and that's who they are. And I also feel like, since we're art historians, I have to take a minute with this comparison to look at what changes between, I mean, like it's a huge amount of time, but 13th century to 19th century paintings, like, even though iconography is pretty stable, although actually the goddesses at the bottom don't have their vehicles, do they? They're
No.
not shown with vehicles.
Yeah.
They're just on lotus pedestals.
Except for the Masas Mardani, who actually does quell these sort of two figures underneath.
Oh, right. And is like the one wrathful of
one
that
wrathful
row.
one.
Yeah. But so much has changed also in like the way that the scarves are shown, in the way that the flames are depicted, right? Like that earlier painting is so stylized with that egg-shaped halo and that ornate back cushion or whatever it is. And then the uppermost one has this, much more modern sense of a flame aureole and kind of funky lotuses.
Right. And you would also notice that the earlier one actually is set in a shrine space with the, yak tail fly was hanging and the canopy under which the goddesses are seated on a pedestal, whereas the one on the top, our example actually is set in a landscape of kind of, with the cloud and the sky indicated and kind of mountaintop. So this sort of landscape feature also comes in from Tibetan painting.
Yeah.
Much later centuries.
Of much later centuries. And then that had come from East Asia. Yeah. Great. Yeah. Alexander, this is the last folio, the colophon. So what is a colophon and how does it help us to know what, when, and where it was made?
Well, a colophon is essentially what the scribe would put at the end of the manuscript, essentially to state on what kind of auspicious occasion this text was completed, where it was completed, and in this case, we also have the name of the scribe as well. So here you can see it has an extremely precise indication of the absolute moment at which this text was completed. And we have the precise day and the name of the scribe in the translation down there on the fourth line, completed by Sri Ratnaputra Vajracharya of Rishtam Kastmandapa Taramula Mahavihara. And so that's that gives the name of the monastery to which the scribe belonged. And this is a term also, Vajracharya, which might come up a bit in this presentation. So maybe just to explain what that means. Vajracharya essentially is a priest in Newari Buddhism, and it's a hereditary position. At some point in Newari Buddhism, the tantric priesthood appears to have become hereditary. So essentially, someone like Sri Ratnaputra here, his father would have also been a Vajracharya, and his children, his sons would be expected to become Vajracharyas. And we also get the name of the donor. In this case, Mr. Balakrishna Tuladar, and the location from which he hails as well is given.
About the language question too. So most of the manuscript is in Sanskrit, but then at the end, the language flips to Newar in this colophon. So why does that happen?
That's a good question. The actual text of the sutra is in Sanskrit rather than the vernacular, and actually we see some translation of Sanskrit at this time, but translation of sutras like this into Newar doesn't really happen until the 20th century. So they're using Sanskrit as the liturgical sacred language, whereas the colophon, which will give information that the donor would like to hear, they'd like to see their name and where they belong to, and that everything was donated. That's in something that they would be able to understand. Mm-hmm. So the Sanskrit text itself, they might even say it doesn't really matter whether you understand the Sanskrit text or not. It actually acts as like a mantra, essentially. And in fact, in reciting the Pañcarakṣā Sūtra in Sanskrit, you are making the goddesses present. So within each of the goddesses' sutras, in each of their sections, they have dharanis and vidyas. These are terms which refer to sacred utterances, like spells. However, in practice, at least today in Nepal, those mantras and dharanis are not recited in isolation. They are the whole sutra is recited in order to invoke and to get the protection of the pancha-rak-sha goddesses. So yeah, it's very important that the sutra be in that language rather than in Newar.
If I may add to that sort of vernacular versus Sanskrit here, because I mean, look at the date of the text, it's 1746, we're talking about mid-18th century. So from the 17th century onwards, you see a lot of sort of kind of Newar vernacular like identity in a way that's really kind of expressed through language, like art making, even sort of placemaking that happens in these. This is sort of still, I think, in the 17th century, it's still three kingdom period. We're looking at sort of change of the dynastic house soon after this point in the 18th century. But Nepal as a place always has this like very distinct identity that they identify themselves within sort of South Asian geographic sort of location. So then the Sanskrit, even the manuscript making here, scribes, you do notice that it is written in Sanskrit, but there would be kind of vernacularizing tendency to change certain sound into more vernacular sound. So there are mistakes that are made that are kind of reflecting how their speech pattern might be, kind of simplifying certain sound. And so you do notice that change happening in Colophons. And this Taramula Mahavihara, this monastery that is identified here, which is in Kathmandu, it actually says Kashthamandapa is the name for a neighborhood in Kathmandu, seems to have been a big center for manuscript production. And this is actually still living Baha, Shikamu Baha in Kathmandu today, but it's no longer that prosperous monastery that seems to have been a very important Baha or Vihara in from the 16th through the 19th century. Actually, they were producing a lot of Buddhist manuscripts. They were serving a lot of different clientele. One such example that is now in the Free Zackler or the National Asian Art Museum in DC. This is a Pañcarakṣā manuscript that's dated 1648, and this we know was also prepared by this Vajracharya's brother. So it's funny that he identified himself as a brother of this Vajracharya Sri Kushaladeva. And Sri Kushaladeva is identified as he belongs to this lineage of Mahapatra, like the great books or great leaves, which seem to indicate there is sort of the prestige that's associated with certain family that actually does this making of the special manuscripts like the Pañcarakṣā manuscript like this. And we have actually another manuscript in the British Library of the Pañcarakṣā manuscript that's done by Sri Kushaladeva. So I am hoping to kind of really round them up and kind of reconstruct the Taramula Mahavihara's sort of, or Taramula Baha's, their business model. And I think we can actually kind of think about what they were doing at the time of production. So this is 17th century, and you have that manuscript. This manuscript actually identifies multiple donors. So our manuscript had only one donor, and that's totally fine, but often, especially a manuscript like Pañcarakṣā manuscript, you will see a pattern. This is very specific to Nepal, where you start seeing main donor name identified, but then also the whole list of the whole family members that are identified to get the merit. Like, it's as if you need to add all of your family members' names to it. So in this case, you have Jaya Dharma is the main donor's name, and his wife Madhulakshmi, and second wife Sarupa Lakshmi, and then son, self-born from Singhavati Jayasingha, which would indicate there's a third woman. So there are, and that's the family portrait on the at the end, sort of there. And another example that you will see next slide. This is in the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, another Pañcarakṣā Sūtra manuscript, and with the donor portrait. And here you are looking at, again, this is again done by a Vajracharya named Sri Ratnadeva, whose name kind of sounds actually similar to the one that our manuscript, the Fisher Library manuscript, is scribed by. And it might actually be family lineage again that's related. So this one, 1671, Darumula Monastery, Vajracharya prepared this for a donor whose names are identified starting with his mother. So it seems there is his mother, and then the main donor. So mother's name is Lakame Lakshmi, and her brother, so his uncle Shakya Bhikshu Sri Ratnasima, and his wife, and then Lakame's first son, Jiva Chandra, who is the main donor, and his wife, and their son. So the whole family, the uncle, his mother is all named, and their whole family relation is named, which is quite interesting. That it seems they also had an unmarried nephew in the mix. So
oh wow,
we have a whole
he gets included.
Family. Yeah, he gets included. So whole family dynamic comes out, and it seems, I mean, I'm sort of thinking this actually, the portrait here might have either mother and the wife, or the, because it really does identify the mother, and also his wife is mentioned in the colophon as well. But they don't depict the whole crew here, but and definitely have some people represented here. And this one, the donor is Shakya Bhikshu. So these are, as Alexander mentioned, these are hereditary, kind of caste-like status that is hereditary. And there's Vajracharyas, there are Shakya Bhikshus, and Duladars merchant community and merchants, and that's our donor. Duladar, probably from somewhere from Kathmandu, has donated the Fisher Library manuscript. So
very cool. Unfortunately, he didn't think to illustrate himself though into it.
No, I think his means might have been not as luxurious, because this is like black paper with gold, actual gold ink, whereas he was working with the yellow paper. I mean, it's a pretty good quality yellow paper with a really nice scribing. Like the letters are so quite beautifully done. So he had the means to hire a specialist from Tarumula Monastery. This is like, hiring somebody from, I don't know, like this press to do something very special for you. So.
Right. But it's interesting to notice then that, I mean, Tarumula Monastery has the ability to produce these like super high patronage manuscripts and high levels of, craftsmanship and material wealth, whereas as well as the manuscript that's in the Fisher, which is nice but not made of gold, and nice like, but not
you can imagine like having custom choices. Do you want black, and how many pages of painting, or how much do you have to actually spare? So it definitely kind of goes with the social status and the wealth of the patron.
Yeah. All right. So can you tell us a little bit about like why the manuscript looks the way it does? So our manuscript is made of paper, but it's emulating something else, right?
Right. So the manuscript is in what I often call putti format, using the Hindi word for book. Putti format books are kind of rectangular, horizontally long, and they're not bound. They have often holes to tie them together, and you need to flip the folios horizontally. So that's the orientation, and that's the shape. And that shape comes from actually earlier tradition of using palm leaf, especially palm leaf and birch barks, and palm leaf in particular are used for making Buddhist sutras in earlier centuries by the we have nice examples surviving from Eastern India and Nepal in the 11th and 12th centuries, and they're all very oblong, rectangular folios, partly because it's actually made from talipa palm, Corypha umbra that actually grows very tall and has just this wide and big folios. So, one folio would be about in the width about 22 inches and 2 inches in height, and they're very supple, or 55 centimeter and 5 centimeter in width, so narrow and long. And that even after really paper is adopted for use, and by the way, like in Nepal, paper does used for manuscript production. By the 12th century, they start actually making paper manuscripts as well. But when it's really wholesale adopted to make paper manuscripts more fully, you do see the tendency to just stick with that format. That actually has something really more, the religious scriptures are always in that format, and it gets retained. So that's why you have that shape. Actually do have kind of Putti manuscript cursor zone to think about. It ties the Buddhist world together, this travel of that format. Even in East Asia, you will find this format kind of retained, not in the way that we see in these Putti format manuscripts, but that shape of the book, really rectangular and horizontally sort of folded manuscript format, actually as something signifying kind of Buddhist teaching and authority that's coming from India. So palm leaf is something that's shared between South and Southeast Asia as well.
Are all Poti manuscripts Buddhist, or are there
No.
Jain?
No, there are
Poti
Jain
manuscripts
and Hindu manuscripts that are. So Putti format is very, I consider it more Indic book. Art of the book is made into that format, so it comes out of that tradition of making manuscript with the palm leaf and birch bark.
Yeah. And what's going on with the Pañcarakṣā Sūtra in terms of its paper? We noticed when we were looking at this manuscript in real life, and even in the photographs, it's quite evident that some of the pages are much newer. There's a few additional pages that have been added in, maybe to replace lost pages or damaged pages.
Yeah, so I mean, as we will see with Alexander, I think he will explain more with how it's used ritually. And because, as I said earlier, this is a utilitarian manuscript, it really gets used a lot, and gets people really use it kind of intensely. The book is not for reading like quietly, it's really to interact with and for presence. So then it gets handled a lot, and often the first page does get damaged. And the things that they offer around the book, including like lamps, and then the things that librarians will freak out if you bring into the library, like
now,
liquids and
oil,
water lamps and incense, like things can burn. And so often when there are damaged folios, they sometimes repair them, sometimes replace them, and this actually has replacement pages. And so although the manuscript bears a date of 1746, but the painted folio, the first folio, especially with the image of Vajradhara, which is very unusual for a Pañcarakṣā manuscript, it seems to be kind of late 19th century, or at least 19th century edition. I'm not sure I would put it in late 19th century, but it's definitely 19th century edition. And you can see the difference in color of the pages. So they're lighter colored or versus sort of much darker color. And you can also notice the writing hand, the scribing hand is quite different. So this is more modern than the original manuscript. And the color of the manuscript actually is the pages are often, colored with gold, not gold, orpiment, the yellow. Then orpiment gets used as insecticidal because orpiment is arsenic, and arsenic actually has insecticidal properties, so they do use it for that purpose. But it also kind of emulates the palm leaf, its coloring with the kind of much brownish backdrop against which the text is written. And there is also emulation of kind of golden tablet with the ink over. So all of that can be achieved by orpiment, and you sort of notice this what looks like a kind of shiny flecks are coming from how orpiment is ground. So when it's coarser, you can actually have this crystalline orpiment crystals that are kind of
Oh,
on the
okay.
surface of the
Yeah, because when we looked at it against scaling light, you could really see like gold flecks
So
in some of the pages.
my sense is this probably, I mean, I cannot confirm without any sort of testing. There needs to be scientific examination of the folios to, I mean, who knows, maybe they actually added gold flecks in it. That's not like out of realm of possibility, but nonetheless, I think it's likely it's orpiment.
More likely the orpiment itself. And then the pages are quite sturdy. So they're made of at least 2 sheets or maybe more pages that have been stuck together.
Right.
So is that common practice?
It is. So it seems, they really want as I said, want this manuscript not just to be something to read and like dispose, but to hold and cherish and really hold and carry. And, that tactility and the presence is so important. So if you're going to, it's a heavy duty item, like, heavy duty used item, you want something substantial. And so often paper gets a little thicker by kind of layering the page, sheets of paper together. I mean, this one at least has 2 pages, and I've seen multiple pages stuck together to create this like almost effect of each folio feels like a sheet of, leather or something. It really does feel very substantial. So that's what's going on here. And I guess
then what's going on also, so there were some new pages, one of them showed only lines, so I don't know, I guess it was never
I mean that's the slide on our left is actually a great example of sort of the process of making, that they actually have applied orpiment on the one side of the page, and I think they're being economic about it instead of putting them on both sides. And you do need the sort of guiding lines. So they do guiding lines and then writing on after that. So the guiding lines will make sure that your letters are neatly aligned, like letters hanging from the laundry.
Right.
Like that's how these letters
keep
are
your Sanskrit regular and beautiful.
Yeah. And then the one on the right is actually showing how the manuscript, or as an object, that objecthood is so important. Its presence is so important that the side of it is colored, edge is colored. So the whole stack from the side is painted. And Sarah, you're familiar with the Tibetan books that have, beautiful painted sides to make sure that when you display it, not to be read even, just to display and have a presence, you have these beautiful patterns of images actually painting around the book, right?
Yeah, that becomes really popular with Qing Tibetan manuscripts.
Yeah.
So they make really gorgeous paintings along the side of the whole book.
Right.
Yeah. But these ones were irregular and red. So just red. And it was also so apparent that it hasn't been done for looking at it from above, because the color bleeds in irregular ways. It's done to be red from the side. Yeah.
Here you actually can see when there is a painted panel, you do notice this paper curtain on top. So that's what the painted panels are often protected by the paper curtains. And I do get asked by museums about should we just remove them, what to do, because sometimes it's been heavily used, so they are kind of falling apart. And if it comes off, it comes off, but if not, you don't have to actively remove them, because it's part of the object's the manuscript's history and how
it's there to protect the painting, it's there to protect it from abrasion, or
so it is there to protect it from abrasion, but it's also when the 5 goddesses are often paired with the 5 Buddhas, but they don't want them to be actually touching each other improperly. So when they, because the folio, so folio 1 and 2, 1 verso and 2 recto, when you open the book, it will be looking at each other. When you put them together, they will be touching each other head to toe, and that's really improper. So because these deities are, the Buddha and the goddesses are considered living or the present in the manuscript, that they don't want to actually be touching each other. So the curtains actually work as a blockade between the two of them actually improperly touching. And another thing to note in this particular Tarimula monastery's creation is that, you know, if you have resources to spare, you can also commission a, you know, block letters for your title page for each goddess. So the first folio actually is invocation of, you know, Namo Bhagavatiya Arya Mahasahasra Maradanya. So you actually have the invocation of the goddess at the beginning, and the goddess is paired with the Buddha Akshobhya there, and you can see it's, you know, they have increased the font size by, I don't know, 3 times. So font 36 versus font 12 is the rest of the text. So what that does when you're actually doing what, again, Alexandria will show us how this is actually used in ritual. When you're flipping the folio and kind of going through the ritual, you know where you are like pretty quickly when the text changes. So they really make sure that you're actually like at that point. And you can also separate the text easily if you're going to distribute between different goddesses. So it serves many roles when you actually have this block print. Or boldface. Boldface is what.
Boldface, right.
It's just to compare the manuscript of the, you know, 19th century repair versus what, if you're looking at 18th century paintings, I mean, they're similar, but slightly probably later is what my guess is. That's another mantra. So these are same goddesses, and this is what I meant by kind of Tibetan inflection with the kind of landscape, the clouds, the sky, and the green that comes in. That's also kind of seen in the painting here.
Yeah. Even the body and face change a lot. All right. So Alex, how are these used? This is an example, I think, of a consecration ritual that you observed.
Actually, this is a consecration ritual that was observed by Christoph Emmerich, who is also at the University of Toronto. So this photo is courtesy of him. And essentially, consecration is very important with Newar manuscripts. And, you know, as you'll see later, in Newar ritual use of manuscripts, you can't just open a book and read it like you would a novel and enjoy it silently from cover to cover. No, you have to go through a process in order to sacralize the space and invite deities and make sure that everything is pure for the recitation. And it's the same with creating manuscripts. So you can't just think, I think I'd like to make pancha-rak-sha today, and then just sit down and start writing. You have to go through a very elaborate process in order to make sure that the book will be useful in rituals. And in order for a manuscript to be useful in rituals, it has to be considered alive. It has to have life. And actually, that life has to be installed into the manuscript. So when I asked Bhadracharyas in Nepal, can you, for example, do a sutra recitation ritual using a printed 20th century edition from India? They said, no, that's nirjiva. It's lifeless, nirjib. So in order to make a manuscript have life, it has to go through a consecration ritual or pratishta. And this is essentially the same set of rites that you would need to consecrate a human in Newar Buddhism. And essentially, the ideal is to emulate the life cycle rites of a Vajracharya, so a tantric priest. And these are outlined in the Kriya Sangraha Panjika by Kuladatta. And there are 10 life cycle rites called dasha, 10, karma, or rituals. So maybe just to highlight some of the ones which are most relevant for the case of sutra consecration or manuscript consecration. One of them is to purify the womb. So in the case of a human, this involves actually a ritual with the mother, and it's something that happens before the Vajracharya is born. In the case of a manuscript, it involves having the scribe purify their hands and body before writing the manuscript, and visualizing mantras in the ink and on their hands in order to empower them. So actually, the ink itself has to be sacralized through this kind of ritual. And then in order to put the deity into the book, into the manuscript after it has been written, there is a puja called Druji Kuryat, which means making firm. So in this ritual, the presence of a deity is actually being made firm within the manuscript. And this is done through the recitation of Vajrasattva Dharani. So this is a sacred utterance, which is repeated 1,008 times or 108 times, depending on time constraints. And in a manuscript, this is interesting because for images, you would just install the deity who is depicted in the image. But in a manuscript, you might ask, what do you do? If it's something like the Lotus Sutra, the Saddharma Pundarika, there's no name of a deity in the title. In the case of Pancha-rak-sha, yes, there is a name of a deity in the title. Now, this is not specified in Kuladatta's manual, but in my conversations with Vajracharyas, it seems that usually it's the Pancha-bhuta that is installed into the manuscripts. Now, this is not really inconvenient for the Pancha-rak-sha manuscripts because, as Jinah mentioned, the Pancha-rak-sha goddesses correspond to 5 Buddhas. However, in the case of other, some manuscripts, let's say it's a Manjushri Mulakalpa or what have you. Yeah, it's a different identity. It seems like a different identity from the deity that is actually identified in the manuscript title. Mm-hmm. Even for a Pancha-rak-sha text or Pragyaparamita, perfection of wisdom, where Pragyaparamita is a goddess, it's still the Pancha-Buddhas, the 5 Buddhas who are put into the manuscript.
So interesting. And is that because the 5 Buddhas cover all, like everything?
Yeah, actually, if you ask a Vajracharya, well, why isn't it Pancha-rak-sha? Why isn't it Pragyaparamita? Oh, well, all 5 Buddhas is everything. It's formless. It's infinite.
Organized,
yeah.
It's an organized system that covers everything.
Exactly. So in the case of something like Pancha-rak-sha, you could say that there is a ritual agency which is coming from the life of the 5 Buddhas, and there is an oral agency. This is my kind of understanding as a researcher, that in reciting the Pañcarakṣā Sūtra, the text of the sutra itself is making the 5 goddesses come to life, but the ritual agency of the actual manuscript that is being exerted is the agency of the 5 Buddhas. So there's these 2 kind of agencies that are present. Another aspect of consecration is name empowerment, which is namabhisheka. So in this case, with an image, it's also very clear. If it's, let's say, if it is a Tara image, then you give the image the name of Tara. In the case of manuscripts, again, it's not so clear precisely what type of family. It's actually a Buddha family that it actually has to be. It has to be given the name empowerment of a Buddha family. So with pancha-rak-sha, it's actually the same as most manuscripts. It's Amitabha. So all manuscripts are usually empowered in Amitabha's Buddha family. But the Prajnaparamita, which is this manuscript here, is actually empowered into Vajrasattva's Buddha family because Prajnaparamita is present in Vajrasattva's mandala. And this is, well, anyway, maybe just to speak a little bit about this particular image here, as it says in the caption, it's a reconsecration. So the actual full consecration of manuscripts from scratch, which I just described, as far as I could tell, isn't occurring in contemporary Nepal. However, we can observe it in a form in these renovation or Jirnotara rituals, where a manuscript like the one that you can see on the left of this image is actually deconsecrated. The life is taken out of it and put into a jar, which you can see the Vajracharya touching with his arm, with his hand. And then when the life is taken out of the manuscript, it can be repaired, because you can think, if the 5 Buddhas are in the manuscript and the 5 Buddhas are perfect, how can you improve on the 5 Buddhas? How can you repair the 5 Buddhas? Well, you can't. So you have to take them out and then you can repair it. And then, of course, afterwards, they put the life back in. So what he's doing here is actually reconsecrating through an elaborate ritual.
Wonderful. So this is the very first folio of our manuscript. This is the top of the piece that on the back of which we think that painting of the 5 goddesses was added later. Although this also it looks like a pretty yellow page. Maybe it's a later edition as well. But I also love that it's painted with these red lines that are, to me, they are made to look like a book cover that's often carved with those beveled edges that go in.
No, definitely that's a reference to the book cover. And then you have, I think, the later edition of this Om Namo Shri Pancha-rak-shaya. So it's invocation of the 5 goddesses at the beginning of this whole manuscript. And I'm sure this 220 years old is added by a dealer or collector who had gotten this manuscript from someone.
Yeah. We were going to ask you, Alex, to talk a bit more about how these actually get used, right? Like, how is the manuscript itself used physically in ritual?
Certainly. So as Jinah mentioned, the 5 goddesses are essentially used for worldly protection. Although, in Buddhism, we often try to think about enlightenment, attaining Buddhahood. In fact, these kinds of pujas for most people are just done for protection from disease or for protection when they're traveling. So with the 5 goddesses, that's really highlighted not only by the contents of the text, but also by some of the things surrounding the text. So after worshiping, you'll get a 5 colored thread, which in the case of most pujas represents the 5 Buddhas. In the case of pancha-rak-sha, if you ask a Vajracharya, they might say, well, it represents the pancha-rak-sha. So you're being protected by the 5 goddesses after doing a worship of them. The location in which these rituals are done is, it can be a monastery or baha, which is Newar for vihara. And this one, Kwa Baha, is actually in Lalitpur. So it's not in Kathmandu, where the Pancha-rak-sha manuscript that we are focusing on is from. But the puja, in many ways, will have a lot of similarities, but it does differ not only from location to location, but even from priest to priest. They will do things a little bit differently. So we really can't make generalizations. which are set in stone, but we can maybe speak in generalities about what happens. So so it can happen at monasteries, but it can also be done in someone's home or in a courtyard. It's really up to the sponsor. So here you see the Vajracharyas reciting from the manuscript, and you can actually see that they're reciting at the same time. So this is something which we don't see in so many Buddhist cultures, but we do see it in some places. In Japan, for example, there's a ritual called Daihanya Tendoku, where the Pragyaparamita Sutra, the Daihanya Kyo, is split between many priests and then ritually recited, not actually recited verbally, at the same time. So here in Nepal, it's done really to make it possible to recite a whole sutra within an hour or two. So if you recite the Pañcarakṣā Sūtra from cover to cover, I'm not sure, it might take 10, 12, 15 hours, depending on how well you can read Prachalit. But if you split it between 5 Vajracharyas, no problem. You can do it in 2 hours.
Right. So they're each doing their own sections at the same time.
Now, it would be very elegant if they split it by chapter, but usually they just split it evenly.
Oh, okay.
So, so the idea is just to have every syllable of the sutra uttered. So it has that kind of that mantra effect.
It will really imbue the space with the sound, the sound of the text, and you will hear it.
So as you can see, it's like a cacophony. There are some Vajracharyas who will recite even prose like they're singing, even if it's not in verse. And there are some who are having some trouble. What is this? What is this in Devanagari? So maybe to talk a little bit about how the framing ritual for the recitation. Like I mentioned, like with writing, you can't just sit down and write. With reading, you can't just open a sutra and read it. You have to make a solemn oath between yourself as a sponsor, if you're the sponsor, and the guru. So in this case, the guru for this puja is the Vajracharya on the far left with the blue blanket on his legs. So he's in charge of this particular ritual, and so the sponsor will treat him as the root guru, Mula guru for this particular puja, and he will do as the guru instructs. So the sponsor has to do certain ritual things, place things in certain places, and he just follows the instructions of the guru. But he has to make a solemn oath between himself and the guru, him or herself, the sponsor, and the guru. And the sponsor can be any gender. You actually see very young people doing it, very old people doing it. So there's no issue with in that regard. In fact, sometimes people who are Hindus, people who don't identify as being from a Buddhist caste, do these pujas. So it's also not limited to religion.
Interesting.
Caste.
Like to accrue merit, to just do auspicious good stuff. Yeah. It
depends from person to person. So you just have to ask, whoever's doing it that day, why are you doing this? I asked, some people, and they say it's for my exams. Some people say my wife is sick for her recovery. Right. For pancha-rak-sha, really it's protection. People usually have in mind protection.
Right.
So for the, you can see a lot of ritual implements in the picture on the right.
Yeah, and right. I love that you can see even the red tika paste or powder and I think the edge of the yellow as well.
Yes.
Photograph.
Yeah.
And you can see a Vajra tipped bell, the Ganta and Vajra would be there somewhere. And you've got a flower garland of marigolds. And what else do you have? You've got a bunch of candles with rice around them?
So those are actually rice crustaceans with some fruit on top.
Okay,
And so
like a
these
food
are
offering?
yeah, these when you put these kinds of things and you honor them and recite certain mantras, it invites deities. So in the case of this one, I believe it's 8 Lasya, Ashtalasya goddesses who are invited to protect the puja. So there's also, with regard to the tika, as I mentioned, the red and yellow usually represents Surya and Vasundhara. And so I don't think you can see it, but there's actually there's a lamp called a Sukunda, and this is used to summon Surya and actually Ganapati or Ganesha, Ganesh. Maybe most people know him Ganesh as Ganesh. And so he's actually, people think of him as a Hindu deity, but he is invited for, he's important and he's necessary actually in Buddhist rituals. And so they are also invited using tika.
And another part of this solemn oath is to bind the mind
of the guru with the text, and the guru's mind with the yajman, with the sponsor. And so actually using tika is one of the ways to do this. So people might be familiar with chakras. So there's certain chakras in your body. And so in fact, because the manuscript is thought of as being alive, as being a deity, there are actually chakras going up and down the central channel of the manuscript, like they would the body of a yogin, the body of a practitioner of a Vajracharya. So actually by putting tika, this red paste, down and then up the manuscript, and at the same time visualizing certain syllables in his body, the Vajracharya kind of links his mind to the manuscript. And because the sponsor linked his mind, his or her mind, to the guru, essentially your minds are all becoming one, and your blessing is essentially being like it's taking on this kind of spiritual dimension. Yeah,
very cool. And so, can I ask you also, what are the men sitting next to in the little baggies? Are those bags of rice?
Let's see here. On
the
the
Vajracharya priests have, they've got little bags beside them, and it looks like rice. Yeah, okay. So part of rice. The ritual exchange.
Yeah, they will
throw the rice.
Right.
Yeah. I think the next slide actually has the details of the tika marks that really shows like thumbprint.
Right.
Really pressing in the heart.
Yeah, these are so wonderful. You can see like actual fingerprints. Can I ask you why the trailing like drips too? Is that just an indication that the tika was wet, or that that it was being like thrown over?
I think it's wet.
Okay.
I mean, sometimes it's dripping.
And there is also like this gesturation that happens during the actual ritual, that kind of drawing, especially like rice in the water that's splashed. That does happen. At
the end of pujas, rice is also thrown, maybe to kind of wrap up that explanation of the puja. So after the deities are all invited, the text is divided. They recite it simultaneously, and and there's a lot of other things which happen, which I won't get into. But when it's finished, actually all of the deities that were invited, they are thanked and given leave through a ritual wherein rice is thrown in various locations towards those ritual implements. This is called kigatine, which just means throwing rice. And then afterwards, the sponsor pays the Vajracharyas, and they have a feast together. They have a breakfast. So another important part of the puja is that, although this is changing now, but traditionally you're not supposed to eat before doing the ritual. You eat after. So you break your fast together at the conclusion. And anyway, deities are also invoked and invited for that feast, which involves very specific types of food. Yeah.
I think this is the sort of last slide we have, and I just kind of wanted to share this example. I don't know if this actually has a text with it. This is another Darimula monastery, sort of product. Actually, this time from Duladar, a merchant, Jayarama, and this is actually dated as Nepal about 797, which makes it 1676 common era, and this the manuscript in the British Library. So this is earlier than our manuscript, the official library manuscript, but it actually is Duladar, donor, and this donor definitely, this sponsor had so much money to spare, and he had the full portrait of the family with the identification of each person. Kind of they're labeled, and they're listening to Buddha, preaching, and he holds the text. So you really have kind of full circle of the goddess, the 5 Tathagatas that are invoked in the manuscript, and then the whole family of the donor really want to be close to the Buddha, and you do see all sorts of offerings that they have in their hands and in front of them. And here too, you can see the tika marks, and also all these splashes of the. It does kind of show how these were at some point open, and there was drawing of the middle yellow powders here and there. So, and the pages open to the Mahapratisara section of the text. So yeah, Darimula Monastery, I think it had wonderful resources, and they had clientele that's really like kind of quite varied, and it's really incredible. Official library actually has one from Darimula Monastery that actually shows a different ring of the kind of clientele that they were serving, it seems. And I think so. That this is a great example of Darimula's production, and also the manuscripts used that Alex wonderfully explained.
Yeah. So wonderful. And it's so wonderful to see the like a portrait like this of so many men and women, which gives us such a clear picture that like lived Buddhism was such a, like societal affair that included everyone, right?
Yeah, even children. You have like little boy and girl at the end.
Oh, at the end. Yeah, they're so cute.
Yeah.
Wonderful. All right. Well, thank you so much, both of you. It was really fun to learn more about this manuscript with you. Check out the Hidden Stories digital exhibit, which is at this website. And for lots more videos, we actually recorded a symposium video earlier in the year. I think it was in February. And there's also incredible other objects from all over the world that have hidden stories and experts willing to share them with you. So please check them out at the link. All right. Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.